Hi, my name is Wesley Lawton, and I am the grief counselor for Hospice of Michigan in Macomb County and the co-facilitator of Men Overcoming Loss, along with my colleague Will Gasper up in the Cadillac area. And so this video is to share our presentation with you from our most recent group. Maybe you were at the group and you want to review the content or share it with somebody else, or maybe you weren't able to join the group. It didn't work out for your schedule and you want to get the benefit of some of the educative pieces of it anyway. And so that's what this video is for. Hope that you get something out of it. And it'd be great to have you join us in the future if you can. So we've been talking about some of the different societal roles that many men feel. And we go over this because we're affected by them. Many guys by many of these roles, whether we know it or not. And so it can help to identify them, to name them, and talk about how they affect our lives, because that gives us the power to be a little bit more in control and to decide how we're going to let them affect our lives, to what extent maybe we embrace them, or we may deny them or limit them in some cases, especially as it pertains to the way that we grieve. We grieve. This affects our grief process, and so we may decide that we want to allow it to affect us differently or to a lesser extent. So I'll go through it, and as I'm pulling it up here, I'll just say that Will, my colleague and co-facilitator, went over this presentation up to this point in the most recent video, which I believe was for July of 2020. So please feel free to view that to get up to speed. But I'll jump right in, continuing the presentation from there. And so the first role that we went over was the role of problem solver. And Will shared a story I've heard him share before. And sorry, Will, if I get some of the details wrong on this. May have been a granddaughter instead of a daughter. It may have been, some kind of something else you put on your desk. But from what I remember, it was his daughter who got him a plaque that he put in his office at the time that says, "Dads are for fixing things and for love." And that's sort of emblematic of this role, because a lot of guys, there's just this expectation that we should be able to just fix things, and we internalize that, and many of us, we fit right into that role very well. Some of us, myself included, fixing, getting out the tools and providing maintenance is an essential role or a part of my identity, and that can be a struggle in itself. But whether you embrace that or however you handle it, it can affect the way that you grieve. You may feel like you need to fix your loss or your grief. You may feel out of control of your feelings and how they're coming up and how they're being expressed. And you might just want to kind of, put in the right formula and make it work. And unfortunately, that isn't the way that our grief process works. So what can help is recognizing that the emotions you're feeling are normal. It's all stuff that you have to feel on some level. It's sort of a signal of what you need to work through, what you need to express, what you're feeling. And so we can take our feelings, our emotions, as signs that we should listen to, pay attention to, and respond to. And again, express, whether that's crying, whether that's talking about it, or writing, or creating something. These feelings need to be expressed. Guilt is a very common grief reaction, which again, that can feed into our feeling of I need to fix it because I'm doing something wrong here. Realize that sometimes we can't control everything that happens. Sometimes it's kind of a gracious word there. I would say that there's much more in our lives that we can't control than what we can control. That's a hard pill to swallow. But guilt lessens with effort, time, and healing forgiveness. So these feelings that you are experiencing, particularly guilt, as you face them and work through your grief and give up the illusion that you have total control over it, then the guilt starts to dissipate naturally. The next one that we went over was controller. I'm holding it together. And this can be related to fixing, but this one is less about action and and how you handle it, and more about how you feel and your relationship to your situation. So going back to what I was saying, there's really more in life that we can't control than that we can. And when we lose somebody we love, as you probably know, that really shines a spotlight on that reality. Um, so many things happened that led to your loved one's death. And I know this without even knowing who you are watching this video, because it's pretty much universally the situation um, that you couldn't control. You couldn't control the illness or how his or her body responded to it. You couldn't control how they were feeling in many ways, or what doctors did or didn't do or didn't know about. Fill in the blank. I could go on and on about all the things you couldn't control. And yet, as the person in your relationship, and I would add for many of us, especially as the man in that relationship, whether it was your spouse, your son or daughter, your brother, sister, even your parents, you feel some level of responsibility. And that's natural. But at the same time, we have this reality that you had little control over it. So what can help is, and I should add, I did this in the presentation as well. Not only can we not control our loss, but so much of our grief process, the feelings that come up, and how we experience grief, it's just sort of like you're along for the ride, like you're either riding the wave or getting buffeted by the wave, but the waves are going to come whether you're ready or not. You can't control what direction they go or how big they are. So recognize that the emotions of grief can be unpredictable. It can, as it says, be triggered by a song, a memory, or a specific date, many other things. Something that somebody says, just out of the blue, and it may be apparent to you why that's a trigger, or it may not. You may not figure it out until much later. You may not be able to control your emotional response. It's often inconvenient, but you can determine to control your behavioral response. So you can feel angry, and then you get to decide what you do with that anger. You can feel sad, you can feel guilty, you can feel fill in the blank, but you decide how you respond to those feelings. For example, as it says, and I like this example, if you're angry, you can choose to exercise rather than doing something harmful to yourself or others. So that's a way you can redirect your feeling for a need to control, which is such a human feeling, and in our society, often such a masculine feeling. You do have control. It's just you've got to set your mind to what you realistically can control, and work to let go of the other stuff. And as we brought up in our group, we've got the Serenity Prayer. And I, of course, now that I'm presenting, I'm blanking on what it is precisely. Anybody in AA is probably shaking their head at me right now. But basically, it's about to know the difference between what we can and can't control, and to respond effectively to each one. The wisdom to know the difference. I certainly remember that part. So look up the Serenity Prayer if you get a chance. It's helpful. I mentioned it's often spouted in AA, but man, it's something that I think we could all benefit from praying every day. Be patient with yourself and forgiving of your reactions. This is a tough time. You need to give yourself some space. Okay, roles ascribed to men. And the next one is self-sufficient. And I want to go back real quick to controlling, because one thing that came up in our group was how a turning point for a lot of guys is, or was in our group. There were two men in particular, and a third one who agreed as well, that they did all that they could do. And this is something you may know in your head, but it's really hard to believe and to wrap your mind around it until you work through some of your guilt. You can't just skip over that guilt, unfortunately. You need to express it and, explore it and contradict it. And it's going to look a little bit different for everybody. But once they did that process, they got to a place of realizing that they really did do all they could do, and so much was out of their control. And they were able to feel more peace about um, their loved one's death and able to continue living without the weight of that guilt. So I wanted to point that out, that came up in the group. That may be the case for you as well. So I'm going to go on to self-sufficient man. Stand on your own 2 feet. And this is especially true in our Western society, I would say, that we are to be independent. We're supposed to be able to do everything on our own. And there are some wonderful things about being able to do that, about not being dependent on other people. But I talked in our group about how so often we think that independence is just better than dependence, or than what's the word? Basically, relying on one another. Collectivism is practiced in many other parts of the world. And many of us are convinced that individualism, being able to do things on your own, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, is the superior way. And I would say that there are some benefits and some detriments to any of these ways of being. But I find it helpful to think of a model of 3 different levels. There's dependence, and that's like being a child. That is, or perhaps maybe an adult in other situations, especially sometimes at a very, very old age, where, or you have some physical limitation that requires you to depend on others. But certainly, I think the archetype here could be a child or a baby who is completely dependent on parents or on guardians, caregivers. And then the next level up would be independence. And that is, as we grow out of childhood, we become more and more independent. We take care of ourselves. Hopefully, we're able to pay our own bills and make decisions for ourselves. And then the next level above that many of us aren't aware of or don't act on, is interdependence. And so that means that you are an individual, independent person, and yet you choose to rely on other people and to have them rely on you. You sort of recognize that we need each other to live life to the fullest. So, that can be helpful to understand that being interdependent, relying on other people, can actually be a step forward instead of a step backward. It can be a sign of growing and of strength as opposed to weakness and admitting defeat. It's the next step. And so another way of looking at this is that you may need some extra help and support from professionals, from people, like me, or like Will, or certainly many other therapists out there. Our role is not that of therapist, but we're trained in some of those skills. But if therapists, counselors, social workers, psychologists, whatever their title may be, they are trained to help you address your current needs. And so why not take advantage of that? You're probably facing one of the hardest things you've ever had to face. And so now is the time to ask for help. Or maybe for you, it's friends or family, and they're able to give you that support that you need. But I encourage you to reach out. So overcoming role problems, and I'll go pretty quickly through here, because the main point here, I think, is grieving is the healing process. So you've got to recognize that your wound is real. Grief brings feelings to the surface, and then they should be expressed, talked about, understood, resolved. Buried feelings can cause prolonged turmoil, bitterness, family problems, and even ill health. And studies show that unresolved grief is a serious problem. So that is one description of the way that grief brings you to healing naturally. But you've got to, as the slide says here, recognize that your wound is real and deal with your feelings, as opposed to suppressing them or avoiding them. It can cause all kinds of problems in your life if you do that. And chances are you're going to have to deal with your grief eventually anyway. So most of us are better off doing it early on, as early on as we can. Give yourself permission to grieve. That's sort of the overarching point. But it helps to recognize some of these roles in this presentation and in the last one that Will went over in the last video. I wanted to share just a couple other things from the group. There was another guy who basically he was facing that day what all grieving people certainly grieving men face on a regular basis. This is what it comes down to. He was just missing his wife. And often you just miss your loved one. That's, it's all kinds of specific issues that come up in ways that's expressed. But at the end of the day, you just miss her or you just miss him. And so Ron Grease, our esteemed author in residence, who wrote Through Death to Life, and he's a volunteer with Hospice. He shared a couple of poems with us. Well, he shared one in the group and recommended another one to me. So I'm going to read that other one to you now because I think it's beautiful. It expresses well what this guy was going through, and maybe you'll connect with it as well. This is Laughter Lost. What he said is, I think I miss her laugh the most. The illness has robbed us of that treat. He wrote this when his wife was dying, not after she had died at this point. Uncertainty and pain have conspired to make real laughing impossible. That special laughter would start slowly, the eyes giving the first hint, brightening noticeably and growing larger in anticipation. Then the mouth would begin, first just at the edges, a crinkling causing little lines to speed slowly to the cheeks. The lines would deepen as the lips parted into a faint smile, then a grin, and finally a full laugh, with the accompanying sounds that couldn't be contained. Then, as if on cue, the tears would come, cascading down reddened cheeks until small rivers were formed. Soon the rush for the tissue to stem the tide, even as she doubled over when the breathing couldn't contain the joy. I think I miss her laugh the most, but deep down where my truth lies, the memory is still fresh. I know it will arise again one day, when the battle is won, the spirit renewed, and the world offers her the opportunity to laugh. And so that, I think, really speaks to the vivid memories that we have of our loved ones. That can help get us through, but that also cause us to miss them, and at the same time feel close to them. And the other thing that I wanted to share, and I'll stop sharing the screen here. Well, no, I won't, because I've got one more thing to share afterward, is his poem. And this speaks to a tool that many of us have access to, not everybody, in the same way. But we talked about some of the guys in the group had voicemails that they had saved of their loved one. And they could listen to those voicemails and sort of feel close to them in those moments. For others, it may be a video recording or something like that, or even photographs. Here's the poem, it's her voice. I played a tape cassette the other day. It was from 1991, during better times, before the spread of the cancer that finally consumed her. It was a session she had with a psychic, the kind of experience that she believed in as she searched for her rightful place in a complicated world. The details are not important, but the part where she laughed in a moment of pure joy is unforgettable. This time I laughed with her in the privacy of my car. For just a moment, I too felt the joy, as I could almost feel her presence. It was shortly after she died that I first found the tape. On that occasion, I only listened a moment and didn't even get to the place with the wonderful laugh. I was already crying and had to turn it off. It just hurt too much. But now it is different. Time has once again worked its unique magic and softened me some, so that the sound of her voice can ease into my being and quietly awaken some of the good memories. I am still wounded, but I am healing. Not much else to say, but I thought that does exemplify what many grieving people experience, and wanted to share that with you, especially because it was relevant to the guys in our group. And if you're reviewing this, I wanted you the chance to be able to hear that again. So I'm going to go on to how you can join us live. Some of the benefits of doing that are getting specific feedback on what you're dealing with. May not have been addressed by this presentation, not only from Will and myself, but from other guys who are walking a similar journey and maybe experiencing the same thing, or may have worked through it already. You can participate in others' grief journeys and give back to them, even sometimes just by being there and saying, yeah, me too, or offering a different perspective, and that benefits you as well. And there's also a sort of healing group dynamic that I believe in anyway, just by being together and identifying with one another. That can be a great help along your journey. This information that we're presenting, I think, is great, but not quite as helpful as getting support from other people. Here's how you can join. I'll let you just view the slide. You can do it from our website. You can go right to this URL that I included, or you can click Grief Support Services up at the top of HOM.org and go from there. It's pretty easy to find. Group meets the third Tuesday of each month from 6 to 7. And there's the URL to join. You can just put it in your web browser, your Google Chrome or your Internet Explorer or whatever else. And that'll take you to the group at the right time. You can also, if you are not able to use Zoom or aren't comfortable with it, then you can call in at the number here and using that meeting ID. So I encourage you to do that for all the reasons that I listed. Thanks so much for viewing this video. I hope that it helps in some way. And I hope that you'll take good care, and it'd be great to see you at our next group. The next meeting at this time is, again, the third Tuesday of each month. So that's going to be September 17th, 2020 at 6 p.m. It'd be great to see you there. My phone number, if you'd like to get in touch with me, is 586-263-8514. My email is wlawton, that's W-L-A-W-T-O-N, @HOM.org. So if you have questions about the group or anything in this presentation, or could use some grief support, just let me know. Thank you very much.